Today we're not going to be doing a Linux tutorial. Today instead we're going to be doing a Symfony tutorial. I was on Discord last night and I was speaking to you guys, doing some code reviews, and the question came up regarding Symfony containers and Symfony services. At what point does a Symfony service get instantiated? And I thought this would be a very good demonstration piece, so I'm going to try and do this in a tutorial now. I know that we haven't done Symfony before in the How to Code Well channel, so I will be skipping over quite a bit of stuff, some foundation stuff, which I will like to do in the future tutorials. But anyway, we're going to dive into the tutorial, which just is a very simple Symfony application. What I've done is I've just removed the guts from the default controller, the index action, so we're just literally spitting out that twig template. Scroll up here into the views, and I've just removed the contents off of that as well. So if I was to go to the browser and refresh my page, we should see, yep, a complete blank screen. Excellent. So we now have a blank slate to play with. What we're going to do is create a service, and then we're going to play with when it is instantiated. Okay. So I'm going to do a slow walkthrough, I guess, on creating services. I know already I've skipped over a whole lot of stuff regarding Symfony, but I really want to focus today on those services and the containers and when it's instantiated, when it isn't instantiated, when you can force it to become instantiated, and so forth. So the first thing I'm going to do is create myself a new folder in the app bundle. We're going to call this helper, like so, and in here we're going to create a new class, and this class I'm going to just call as checker. Okay, so in this class I'm just going to have a private variable. We're going to call this is valid, and what I'm going to do in this tutorial is I'm going to throw in a lot of bad practice, because then I can talk about that in good practice terms later on. So if you see any code smells in here, then just bear with me until the end of the tutorial. So we're also going to have a public function, and we're also going to call this is valid. Again, a code smell, I know. And that is going to have a value coming into it. So that is just going to be variable val. We're going to equal that as a default to be b. And then we're going to simply have if is if val is equal to a, then we're going to set this is valid to be true. Okay, then what we're going to do after the if statement is simply return this is valid, like so. So it's just a very basic class, really. We have this one method here, which is valid, passing in the string of well, in this case the default is B, but it could be A or C or whatever. But if the value is A, then we set the is valid to be true. Now the reason why I've set that to be false to begin with is to demonstrate that it will be set to false when the class is instantiated. In this method, then, we return that that property. So this is going to return a Boolean. Okay, good. So now in so that's the checker. Now in the default controller, what I need to do is pull back that service, pluck that service out of the container. We do this using the this get, and we pass in the service ID, the service sort of reference, if you will. And that's a string, and we need to define that, and we do that within the services.yaml. Now the services.yaml, it could be in the bundle, but what I've got at the moment is I'm just going to put it in the default services in app, in the top level app config. So the services part here, we're going to have app.checker. This could be called whatever you wish, but I'm just going to keep it app.checker. And then we're going to define the class, and that is the class path, the path of where that class lives. So in this case it's app bundle, and then it is helper, I think I put it in, and then it's checker, like so. Okay, so now let's scroll down to the default controller, So now I can do app.checker. That is going to pluck that out of the container as a class. So we can set that, so that is checker like so equals that. Now what I haven't done in here, obviously, in the checker itself, is created a namespace. Namespace is app bundle, and then this is, what is this, helper. There we go, that's good. So that's the namespace of that class that we've created. So in the default controller, we can pluck that out, like I've said, which means that we have access, of course, to the isValid method on that class. Okay, so what I'm going to do is set up some basic values and then create a feedback loop so we can actually see what's going on the page. If you're sort of thinking, what on earth are you doing? Just bear with me. This will hopefully come clear in just a second. So let's do a HTML, because what I want to do is print out some HTML to the page. We obviously need to have a value. We're going to set that to be A. We're going to pass that value into the isValid method, and that's going to return a Boolean, like I've mentioned, which means that we can have an internal isValid. Again, bad practice, I know. Let's just call everything isValid today. Equals isValid. Which means that we can start printing some stuff out to the page, because now that is either true or false, depending on whatever that value is. So let's print something out. Let's do HTML, and then let's concat that to be isValid, and then let's also concat that to the isValid value. Because it's HTML, we can have a line break, a breaking rule. And what we've got here, that is a Boolean. Now, Booleans don't display very well in HTML, obviously, because they're Booleans. But what we can do is just simply do a JSON encode, because we're going to encode that value into a string, which means that it's going to display as true or false in the literal text, true or false. And then after that is done, we can simply do HTML. So what I'm doing here is I'm passing some parameters into the Twig template. So HTML is equal to HTML. So that will be this string here, isValid, and that will either be true or false. Passing that in to HTML, which means that we can go all the way to, let's close that down. So app, and then resources, index.html.twig. And this is a Twig variable, so we can do HTML, and I'm just going to pass that or pipe that to the filter of raw. Fantastic. So let's scroll down to the default controller. What I'm going to do is just double check my work, make sure that everything is wired up correctly before I refresh the page. So we have the HTML, which is a blank value string. We have the val variable, which is set to A, which is capital A. We have the checker, which is plucking out the checker service from the Symfony container, and then we can access all the bits and pieces off of checker, which we only have the isValid public method. We can pass that in, that val variable into there, which means that that is going to return true or false. Then we have this line here, which will print that out, and then I've gone and printed that out to the screen. So we've got the passing that into the index.html. I just want to double check a couple of things first. So checker, we've got the namespace in. That's looking good. That's looking good. Check on the services. I think that looks cool. So what I'm going to do here is just go back to the browser, refresh the page, and there we go. So we have isValid : true. So that obviously makes sense, right? Because we've passed in A. A is true by the terms of the checker. Of course, if we were to change this to be, let's go back to the tutorial, change this to be B, like so, refresh the page, this will be false. So if we refresh this, it will be false. Fine. Let's put it back to A though. And what I want to do is do this within a loop, because I want to demonstrate how the services get instantiated, or when they get instantiated, and how you can manipulate that. So instead of doing just val is equal to A, let's do an array. So ARR is equal to an array of A, and then B, and then C, oops, C, and then D or whatever, anything that isn't A. So basically that is going to pass. This should all fail, right? And then we have a for each loop, and we have ARR for each ARR as val, and we're just passing that into the service as before. And because we're concatenating that, that means that the HTML is always going to be printed out on another line because we're using the BR. I thought ahead. So let's save that, go into the browser again, and let's refresh the page, and we should see true, 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 true. Why, though, is everything set to true when it should be set to false? Now, what I'm going to do is just go through the motions. There's probably people out there going, oh, I know, but let's just go through the motions. Let's just break this down a little bit. Let's go back into the code. What I'm going to do is pull back the actual default value of the checker. So let's go into the checker, which is down here. And I'm going to create myself another public function. And this is just going to get is valid like that. And all it's going to do, quite simply, is just return this is valid. The actual property is valid because, like we've said, when we instantiate the class, this should be set to false. So let's save that and go back into the default controller. I'll just drag this over here so you can see it a little bit better. So what I can do is copy that, put that above here, and do default, like so, and then JSON encode checker, and I called it get is valid, like so. I just want to double check that I did call that as it was. So get is valid is what I've called it. Get is valid. Yep, that looks good to me. So here we can see that we have the first one, default, and that is set to false. That is because we're instantiating that service. The first time we pull that out from the container, we instantiate that, therefore it's set to false. We then do an is valid, and that is true. A is true, so that's true. However, the rest of it is also true. Now, this obviously is a failure because the other strings were not set to A. However, this is a demonstration that shows that the services are actually shared in the container. So we're not actually instantiating a new class. We're not actually bringing out a fresh instance of the service. We're literally just bringing back the same instance we had before, and because we haven't reset the value, the is valid property, it's going to use the old one, and therefore it's always going to be true, even though the strings that we pass to the is valid method are going to should set it to false. Let's go back into the code. I'll demonstrate what I mean in just a second. So this one here, this one is the first one that we push through. That should work. That is going to set it to true, which is the case. These are all wrong. These should all be A if they are to be true, but we're not getting true back. That is because when we're iterating over the array here, what we're doing is on the first case, we instantiate the class. On the second case, we pull back that class. We don't instantiate a fresh instance. We pull back that service, and therefore we're going to use whatever is set on the default. And we can go into the checker, look like here, and we can actually see the mechanics of this problem. So we put in the value, we default it to B, getting the default, which would be false, which is the first one that we've got. But this is the issue. If val is equal to A, we set the is valid property to be true. We don't reset it if it is false or if it is not A, okay? So we don't reset it. There isn't an else here, which means that this is constantly going to be set, which means that it's going to be set for every shared instance of that service. So there are a couple of things we can do to fix this, and then what I'm going to do, I'll demonstrate those, and then what I'll do is I'll talk about the good practices and so forth. So the first thing we could do to fix this, I guess, is to always set this to be this is valid, set that to be false every time. However, this still isn't fantastic. Let's press save. I'll show you why in just a second. Go into the browser here and refresh the page. Okay, so we've got default is set to false, fine. Then is valid is set to true. Default again is set to true because we're using the same default that was set in the previous instance. We then check all of these things, and because we're resetting them on every check, we have false, 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 and false. So this one here isn't correct. This one should also be false because on every instance of this service, we should be setting it to false. Otherwise, what's the point in having, if I go back to the tutorial here, what's the point in having that set to be false? This private property is false when we can just simply override this by calling this instance in a sequence. So what I'm going to do is just remove that. We're going to save that. The next thing we can do, which is in the services, is actually configure this up slightly differently. As I've mentioned, that these services are shared in the container. We can actually tell the container not to share these services, and so every time a service is requested, a new instance is instantiated. We do this by typing in shared, by putting in the shared property here, setting that to be false, which means that for every time we call the app.checker, we're actually getting a fresh instance of app.checker. So let's save that now. Let's refresh the page. I'll just demonstrate, actually, before I do that. In checker, we've removed that, reset. Refresh the page. And we can now see that the default has set to false because we are issuing or requesting a new instance. We're not sharing that instance among other things. Now, you might be thinking, well, that fixes the problem, surely. But in actual fact, we've only done this a couple of times, like 5 times, right? But just imagine if you're looping over something quite a lot. There is a lot of overhead here. You're getting another class instance. It's not fantastic in terms of performance. Yes, there are times when you need to use it. I can think of several actually, especially with using command line scripts when you're using lots of looping and stuff around those kind of things. But in this context, in this use case, I don't think getting a fresh instance is a good idea. I'm going to be talking about what I would do now. So let's go back into the tutorial. Personally, I think that this class is a bit of a mess. What I'm going to do first of all, though, is just remove the shared part here. So we now have all the services are now shared. Go back into the checker. This, to me, feels like a utility class. This feels to me like it should be returning a value. It should only have a single responsibility. At the moment, it's got more than one responsibility because we're actually setting something. If we're actually setting is valid, and you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, that is the only thing in here. But just imagine this class could be quite big, right? This, to me, needs to be broken down a little bit further. So I don't think it needs to have this is valid because I don't see the point. If we're only returning true or false based on the value that's coming in, we shouldn't be storing anything about that value. If we want to get the status of that value again, we simply just call is valid on that object. We shouldn't be changing the object or the value that is being sent to us either. So let's remove that, and let's remove this. Let's just remove all of that, bring this up here, and close that off. That's good. So what I would do instead is, instead of return that, I would actually probably return a ternary operator. So let's do val and then question mark, and then do equals a, and that's going to be true, or it's going to be false, or else it's going to be false. So what we've done here is we've really simplified the code. So here we're just returning true or false. It's very readable. We're just checking if the value is A. If it is, we're returning true. If it's not, we're returning false. That is exactly what we were doing before, but now we're only doing it in a single line. In fact, I would probably go further than this, and I would create this as a static function. This re-architecture means that we are preventing the use of this keyword, because you can't use this. You can't access properties in a class when you're within a static method. There is no need to, so we shouldn't allow it. So let's save that. Let's go into the default controller and tidy a lot of this up as well. So let's, instead of calling this is valid, because that doesn't work anymore, we can simply do checker, and that is valid, and we can also run that again in here, passing in the value. I'll just drag this out a little bit to make a little bit of room. Bear with me a minute, like so. Apologies for that. Passing in val, so we can remove all of this stuff. And basically what I'm doing is I'm just calling the is valid statically. This one I'm not putting anything in, so I have the default value of is valid, the return value of that. This one I'm actually passing in the val of each one of these. I've removed the shared property from the service configuration. Let's save this and see what we've done on the browser. We're going to refresh the page, and there we go. We have false by default, then it's true, then it's false, then it's false, then it's false, then it's false, which means that we can work on each one of these individually. So let's say I wanted to change the second from last one to be A, which therefore should be true. Go back into the browser here, refresh, and then we have true. Why is that true? Why are these not true? Why are these false? Well, that is because we've created it statically. It's because we're not saving any state within our application. There is no need to for the context of this application. And it is a very sort of single responsibility. Is this valid? If it is, it's true. If it's not, it's false. There's no need in this context to save anything about the object. That should be held against the object, in my opinion, or the value, I should say. So let's just go back to the tutorial. I'll just do a quick recap because I know I've skipped through an awful lot of stuff. So we have a service which is defined in config services.yaml. This is the services section. We pass in the app.checker, that is the ID of the service that we want to use, as well as define the class. Services have an awful lot of options that you can supply. I just showed you one which was shared. If you set shared to be false, then a new instance of that service will be pulled out of the container, which means that it won't be shared amongst the other bits and pieces in your application. It's okay to do that, however, you need to be aware of the overhead in doing so. If we scroll down to the bottom here, we've got the index, which just displays the HTML, and the default controller, which calls that service, looping through each one of these parts here. I'll just drag this out a little bit. Then calling JSON encode to return true or false. Now, like I've said, setting the shared option of the services configuration to be false is fine in some circumstances, but in this case, what I needed to do really is take a step back, take a look at the code, see what it is that I'm trying to achieve. And actually the fix, the most efficient fix, in my opinion, was to do an architectural change and call that statically and not save the state of the is valid value. Now, if you want to access the Discord server, if you want to talk to other programmers as well as myself, and if you want to support the channel at the same time, then I'll put links in the description down below. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll see you again next time. Cheers. Bye. Welcome to the next part of the Symfony service tutorials. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to extend what we did in the previous tutorial, which was creating a service. We're actually going to start injecting other classes into that service, and we're going to be looking at what we did previously and make it a little bit more real world, make it a little bit more extendable as well. Let's go back into the code here. This is what I did previously in the first tutorial. You can get this on Git. I'll put a link in the description below. What we're doing here in this default controller is we're looping over this array of values. We're then getting out the checker service, and we're checking whether that value in this array is valid or not. And we're doing this statically. We're calling this static method is valid. If I go into the checker here, you can see this is the method. And it's just checking whether or not the value is A or whether it is B, and it's returning true or false. Simple enough, however, it's not very extendable, and it's not very real world either. Perhaps this value isn't a value, perhaps it is actually an object. Maybe we're validating user entities. And that is what we're going to be doing today. So let's go to the default controller. What I'm going to do just to simplify things is just create a standard class. I'm not going to create a user entity because it's slightly out of the scope of this tutorial. What I'm going to do, instead of have an array here, we're going to cut that out. We're also going to remove the default stuff as well because we know what all that does. Let's move that like this, remove the array. And what I'm going to do is do a user, and we're just going to create a new st class like so. And we're going to create some bits and pieces on here. So we've got a user which has a first name, and this name is going to just be my name, so Peter, and then the last name like this. Last name is equal to Fisher. Like so. If I can spell my name, that'd be fantastic. So it's just got two values at the moment, two properties, but it's more complicated than just an array of strings. So how do we go about and validate this? Well, we would send this object to the checker, and the checker would have some rules against it. Now, at the moment, it's static, and that's fine if it's just a one-off, but perhaps we want to have more extensibility to this validation routine. Let's just pass that in as the user, so copy that, put that into here, like so. Let's go into the checker. Now that's actually going to be an object, which is the st class. So we're going to just pass that in as user, like so. That's going to be not have a default, and we're just going to remove this stuff. Now this is still going to return true or false, a boolean, whether or not it's valid, but the routine, the actual logic of checking whether it is valid or not needs to be put somewhere. Now you could say, let's just put it in here, and you could just do if, let's say if empty, or if is empty, sorry, if empty user, let's do first name, do something, and then perhaps again if empty last name. I mean, you could probably go, you should probably go even further than this. Check that just because it isn't empty, make sure it's got valid characters. You can think of all sorts of stuff. This user could have a password, and therefore there could be some regular expressions and all of this kind of jazz. It could be quite a beefy piece of validation work here. And this static class, yes, it's okay. You could use it like this, but it's not very extendable. It's not very user friendly. It's not very developer friendly. Let's just save that like so. Let's just have errors here. So error. So say is valid. Let's put a default in. So is valid equals false, and then we have is valid. Sorry, is valid here. Let's do that as false as well, and false. And then, or maybe you could have an array. That's probably better, actually. So you could have errors. I'm just sort of thinking as I go. Errors equals an array. And you could do errors, and then you could add some sort of message here. So please add a username or first name, even. That's what it should be, first name. And then another one under here. So please add the last name, and so forth. And then what we can do here is just do a simple sort of ternary operator, just to say, if we count that we have errors and that is greater than 0, then we return false. If not, we return true. And let's just put a question mark in here, which means that what we're doing here is we've got a series of routines to check whether or not the user is valid, and we're adding a value into a value into the errors array, and then we're counting the errors array. If the count is greater than 0, then it's going to be false because there are errors. The problem with this, of course, is that we're now mixing a lot of stuff. Okay, not only have we got the validation in here, but we've also got the messages as well. Okay, so the messages might have different languages, so you might be wanting to have a different text in Spanish to that in English to that in French, and you can't really do that very easily from here. If you think about the whole sort of validation of a user, it actually depends on quite a lot of stuff. So this really isn't the best thing to do. Ideally, what you would want to do is start injecting things in, perhaps inject a translation service in, perhaps inject the rule set of how we want to validate this user. And so what we need to do is actually create ourselves a public constructor for this checker and start injecting some bits and pieces in. What I'm going to do actually is just change this class, change the name of this from checker to be user validator. And let's just copy that and change the actual name of that class as well to user validator. But thinking about that, the user validator itself should actually be called something different. It should actually be called user validation, because what we're doing is we're doing validation on the user. So let's do user validation instead. So let's do validation like so. And again, I'm going to change that to be user validation. Now what I need to do, obviously, is change the wiring up of this. So if we go to app and we go into, config and services, let's change that to now be user validation. Change that as well, because it doesn't really describe what this is doing. So let's do user validation. And actually what I would prefer to do is say, well, it's validation of the user. Why I do that? Well, it's because you could have different types of validation. You could have validation of a product. You could have validation of a shopping cart. Okay, and therefore it's validation that is the domain, and then we're going to, the topic that we're dealing with is a user. The topic could be a product. The topic could be anything. So there we go, validation user. Save that, or it could be validation.user if we have lots of them. So also I need to change that in the default controller as well. What I'm also going to do is remove the fact that this is static. So we're going to change that to be user validation. And we're just going to copy that. And we're going to change that to be a method, a public accessible method. So let's change that as well. So we're going to remove the static, and I'll show you why in a minute. Now, like I've mentioned, the guts of this is valid method could be quite large. Okay, we're also mixing a lot of things. We're mixing messages and validation rules. Ideally, what we want to do is start decoupling bits and pieces to make things a little bit more extensible. And the way I would do that is I would inject perhaps a series of validation rules into this. And the way you would do that, of course, is by creating a public function, which is a constructor, and we would start injecting other services into this service. So what we're going to do is we're going to inject something called user validator, and this is why I changed the name of it before. So validator, which is user validator. And I know we haven't defined this yet, but bear with me. If we do this user validator is equal to user validator, and again we need to have a public, or sorry, a private thing here. So user, I'll just copy that in, that should be cool. User validator, and essentially what we're going to do is, if I just do this as commented out, we're just going to do user validator, and then we're just going to do a validate like this. It will all become clear in just a second. Let's just remove that. So basically this is all going to be replaced by that, which means that we can change the validation rules and so forth later on in the future. I'll be talking about that in just a second later on in this tutorial. So let's just save that. We need to actually define this user validator, of course. So in helper, perhaps not in helper, maybe we need to do another folder just to make it a little bit more verbose. Now bear with me because I have a spelling mistake here. Let's just change that to this one. And also what we need to do is change that class as well, like so. And we also need to change this as well, and this like so. Let's put that to lowercase, and all of these things. Apologies, I am rubbish with my spelling. So that's lowercase, and that's going to be lowercase too. Marvelous. Okay, so this user validator is going to have all of the rule sets for validation. So it's basically going to be doing what this is doing. However, this is only concerned with whether or not it is valid. Let's just put that in here as well. There we go. So let's copy that and put it into here. So we need to have a public function, and we're going to have just validate like so, and we're going to pass in some bits and pieces like that. We're going to pass in the user, and then that's going to return the errors like that, which means that now we've decoupled this logic, the actual action of validating, from the user validation class, which means we can remove this and we can do that, and we can do errors like so. Now the thing is, what we haven't done is we haven't actually injected, we haven't wired this bit up, which is what I'm going to demonstrate in just a second. Let's just save that, go back into the default controller and see what we've done. So we've created just a new standard class, but this could just be an entity, if you will, a model. And then we've just created a first name and a last name, and we've just put in some values here. We're then pulling out the validation user, and we are just creating, or we're just calling the public method is valid, passing in that object. Now you would have different rules sets on this, different constraints to ensure that this particular thing is actually a user entity, if it is an entity, but we won't deal with that too much today. Let's save that. Let's then go into the user validation, and the user validation used to be the checker class, but this is now user validation. What this is doing is we've still got the is valid, but it's passing the user to another class called the user validator. The user validator has the rules for validating the user, which means that if in time these rules change, we don't have to play around with the user validation class, we simply just have to change. Now remember, the user validation is a service, and we pull that service out of the container like so. What we haven't done, of course, is if I go back to the user validation service, is we haven't told the container that we wish to inject the user validator into this service. And we would do that in the services.yaml. So what I need to do here is create another service for the user validator and inject that into the user validation service. So above here, I'm just going to have another service. We're going to call this app, and then we're going to call this validator and underscore user. And that is going to have the class of app bundle, and that's going to be a what did I have it set to? Validation, and its class name is user validator. And that's looking fine. Let's just make some room on these things so you can see each one. Now in the user validator, of course, what I need to do is create a namespace. So we're going to do a namespace, and this is app bundle, and it's validator, or validation I should say, validation, like so. We're going to save that. That looks good. And back into the services.yaml. Now looking at both of these paths to the classes, I can see that this is going to get a little bit confusing. We have a helper and we have validation. This is validation and this is a validator. So what I'm going to do is just tidy up the folder structure here. So inside validation, we're going to have a new folder, and I'm going to call this validator, like so. And I'm going to just copy that class into here. All good, and I'm just going to delete this from there, and then I'm going to just copy that into validation. Just bear with me a minute, this will make sense. Let's remove the helper. There we go. So we have a validation folder, and in validation we have a validator folder. And in there we have the user validator, and inside the validation folder itself we have user validation. This to me is a better folder structure than having helper and validator and validation and so forth. So we need to wire this up. So if we go into the services, this is now validation and this is now validator. And this is just validation, and this is user validation, like so. So we have a validator and we have a validation. So we're doing basically two things here. We're making sure that the rule sets are valid, and then we're making sure that the overall validation is sound. So that's the new folder structure. Just to show you, I need to change obviously the namespaces. So app bundle is now, helper is now validation, and user validator now has validation, and then that is a validator. All right, validator, like so. Okay, so now that's all wired up, we can now start playing with injecting this in as a dependency to the validator class, or the validation class, I should say. We do this through an argument, so it's arguments. And it's an array, which means that we can put in more than one argument, obviously, into the constructor of the user validation class. These could be properties, these could just be simple values, or these could be other services. And we're going to be putting in another service here. And that service, of course, is going to be this service. And we're going to have an @ symbol, because @ symbols denote that this is going to be a service, and we save that. This is saying that we want to inject the validator user into the user validation service. So what this is doing is it's wiring up, it's injecting this service into this class, like so. And what I can do is just do a use, because it uses it, a user validation or validator, like so. That seems good, which is that, and just for argument's sake, I'm just going to put in a comment like that. Okay, so what we're doing now is we're saying that we're going to validate the user. Okay, we're going to pull out the validation user service, and as we do that, what's going to happen is it's going to inject the validator into the validation class, which means that when we call the isValid on here, what we're simply doing is we're going to the validation and we're saying isValid. We're pulling out the user validator, which is this up here, and we're validating it. I'm going to refresh the page, see what happens, and we can see that that is now valid. Let's just bring that up a little bit so you can see it. So isValid is now true. Now, of course, we can make this invalid by going back into the tutorial and changing in the default controller one of these. So let's just say that that is blank. Let's save that, refresh the page, and now we can see that that has turned to false because the validation rule is that this must not be empty. But what have we achieved here? It seems like we've done an awful lot of code for perhaps not a lot of gain. Well, in actual fact, we've gained quite a lot of flexibility, extensibility, that we can play with all of these rule sets in the future without interfering with the actual overall validation class itself. And you might be thinking, well, what's the point in any of that? Well, if we go to the validation itself, here we're not actually defining how this is going to be validated. We're not defining the rule set. What we're doing is we're injecting the rule sets in the validator in here, and then we're checking whether it is valid or not. We're then doing a validator on that, which means that we can tamper with all of these rules as much as we want. It's not going to interfere at all with the flow of the logic. And by doing that, we have simply decoupled this rule set from the controller, from the validation itself. Now, we could go even further than this. We could also inject a translation service, which means that we can translate these error messages. We could have all sorts of different validation classes, and we could be changing the services.yaml by changing that to other services, other ways of validating things. And it basically is it's like a plugin. You've just created yourself a very nice plugin. Now, I did say right at the start of this tutorial, we are going to be dealing with interfaces, PHP interfaces. And that's what we're going to be focusing on now, because we could have different services that validate different things, different validation rules. Perhaps, for instance, there is a different rule set for an admin user or just a general user. So let's just copy that, and I'm going to just paste that into here. Let's just format that a little bit better. And instead of user, we're going to be doing an admin. And we're going to have admin validator, or admin user validator, perhaps. Let's just keep it admin for now. And then in here, we're going to create a new class. I'm just going to copy that one, paste that into here. We're just going to call this admin, like so, and put that in. And the admin validator is going to have different rules. Perhaps it might have a different check, or perhaps it checks if, I don't know, it has a different strength of password maybe. So let's put that in here. So let's do user, and let's do password is equal to, let's just say ABC, a very weak password. And in the admin validator here, we have a check here to check whether or not the password is longer than 3 characters, for instance. So we could have a string, and we could say that is the password. And if the password is less than, say, 5 characters, then we have please have a better password or something like that. So here we're just saying if the length of this string is less than 5, then we throw an error. Now, of course, what we've done is we've duplicated some work here because we have the if empty first name, if empty last name, which is exactly the same as this bit here. So what we could do is we could extend the user validator like so, and we could remove all of this, and we could do a parent validate, passing in the user again, and we could just set errors to be that as well, which means that we now have a hierarchy of classes. So now the admin validator will validate the user just as a user validator would, but it would also add this check in here to validate the password. Let's save that. Now, the problem with all of this, of course, is that we have we're defining a series of definitions around these classes, but we're not actually enforcing those definitions. And so what we could do is we could create a interface. So in this interface here, let's do a new interface. So this is going to be an interface, and this interface is going to be called validator interface, and it's going to have a public function called validate, and that is going to pass in as a user as the first argument. Now, this could be obviously if it's an entity, you can actually define what it is that we're passing in here. And of course, if you're running PHP 7, you could define the return type as well. Let's just save that as is. Now, what we need to do is implement the validator interface, which is fine because we're running that. So what we've done here, of course, is we've defined a class definition. We've said that this class, admin validator and user validator, must have a validator interface. It must have a function called validate, which is fine because those both have that. Also, we could have different types of validation as well. Like I said, we could have a validation on perhaps products if it was a shopping cart, or other types of entities, other types of things. And we could define the definition of the validation services. So let's just create a new interface called validation interface. And this, of course, is going to be an interface called validation interface. And it's going to have a public function, and we're going to have is valid. Again, that's going to pass a user, and obviously if this was PHP 7, we could be returning the type as well. So let's save that, and let's implement that. So we implement the validation interface and save that. By creating these interfaces, what we can do is decouple the user validator and validation routines even further. In this class here, the user validation class, we're saying that we must inject the user validator into this class. But in fact, it doesn't matter what validator we inject. This could be an admin user, or this could be just a normal user. So we only care about injecting a class into here that is defined by the validator interface. So instead of having user validator, let's do a validator interface. Like so. So I'm just going to change these up here, and validator interface, and we're going to remove that because all we care about is having the access to that public validation. Let's just double check that that's still on the path, which is fine. And that means now we can start playing with what classes are actually being injected in a more of a plugin type way. So by decoupling that, it means that we can change what type of validator we are supplying into this. Because if we go back up to the services here, we have these two validator services. We've got the user validator and the admin. They both adhere to the validator interface. which means that we can pump that through. So for example, here we're supplying the user interface, and if I was to save this and refresh the page, we can see that this is now false, and that is because if we went into the code again and went into here, we changed that back to a name, so Peter for instance, save that, refresh the page, that should now be true. That is because we're injecting the user validator. So let's inject the admin validator. Go back into the tutorial, and in the services here, if we change that to be admin and save and refresh the page, that is false. Why is that false? Well, let's go back into the code and take a look. Let's go back to the default controller. What we're doing here is we're creating this new standard class, which is user, and we've given a password which is 3 characters long. Now remember, up in the services here, we're injecting the admin validator. Now the admin validator is this thing here, and that not only extends the user validator, getting the validation off of the user, so it's checking the first name and last name, but also it is checking the length of the password. So if it is less than 5, then it throws an error. So it adds this into the errors array. That gets returned to validate. And of course, we're running the user validation. And if the count of errors is greater than 0, then it is false, else it is true. So what we've done is we've totally decoupled the rule sets, and we can change these like switches in the configuration. If I was to go up to the services here, change that back to user and save that, and go back into the browser, refresh the page, that will now be true because we're validating it as a user. Now I do admit that this tutorial is quite lengthy. I've covered quite a bit today, and I was flicking back and forth quite fast. What I'll do is I'll commit this code to the How to Code Well GitHub repository. I'll provide a link in the description below. If you've got any comments, questions or queries, do put them down in the comment section. Also, if you want to support this channel, talk to the community and myself, then do join the Discord channel. I'll put a link in the description below. As always though, thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding everyone, and I'll see you again next time. Cheers, bye. Welcome to the third part of the Symfony service tutorial series. Today what we're going to be doing is debugging our services. We're not actually going to be writing any code today. What we're going to be doing is going into the terminal and discovering and inspecting bits and pieces about the services that we've created. We're also going to discover what other services are available to us, what services came with Symfony when we installed it. So let's go into the terminal here, and I'm in the tutorial_3 folder. If I was just to do an ls, we're in the root folder here, and the thing we need to do is access the console, the Symfony console. Now please bear in mind that I'm on a legacy version of Symfony. If you're running Symfony 4, Symfony 3, then your console will be found in a different folder. It will be in the bin folder. But in this version that I'm using, the console command is actually in the app folder. So what we need to do is type php, because it is a PHP command, and then app console. And what I'm going to do is just press enter here. This is going to list out all of the commands available to us. If we scroll up, we're going to find in the debug section here, the debug container. That's the one we need. Let's copy that and run that in here. So php app /console. Again, this is going to be a different path to you if you're using a different version of Symfony. And then just paste that in, so debug container. Now what this is going to do is it's going to list out all the services available to us. This is fantastic, especially if you can't remember what the service ID is of a particular service that you're using. I use this all the time to discover the services available to me for things like doctrine. So if we scroll up here a little bit, we can see that we have all the translation stuff. We've got all the templating, Swift.
scroll up a little bit further, we've got monologue and all the form bits and pieces, as well as the doctrine stuff. Now, where is our stuff? Well, this is in alphabetical order by the service ID. So our stuff is right at the top because we created these three services: the app validation user, the app validator admin, and the app validator user. Now, if I was to just copy one of these and go to the bottom here, and if we were to run this again but pass the argument of the service ID that we wish to inspect, then we actually get some information about that service that we've created. So here we have the service ID, which is app validation user. We have the class. This is the class of that service. We also have tags. Now, don't worry too much about tags. I'll be discussing these later on in other tutorials. And we have the scope here. Now, the scope is set to container. That is the default value, but of course you can have different containers yourself. And in the first tutorial, I showed you how to set shared to false, and therefore it's not a shared service amongst the container. We also have other bits and pieces like public, synthetic, lazy, and so forth. I'll be showing you all of these kind of things later on in future parts of the Symfony service tutorial series. Now, it's quite a lot to go through here. If we scroll up again, we've got loads and loads and loads of stuff, and even though we have this list, it can be quite daunting. It can be quite difficult to actually pinpoint what it is we need, because some of the things that we might be after, for example, might be just simply lost in this noise of service IDs. So in order to whittle down this list, if you know that the service ID perhaps starts with app, then you can actually narrow down this list. We can press up on the keyboard to go back to the previous bash command. Let's just remove that space here to make it a little bit easier to read. What we can do is just remove a validation underscore user and just have app. Press enter here, and what we've done is we've got a whole list of services that have app dot. Now notice we have a selection here, 0, 1, and 2. And if I pressed up and down on the keyboard, I can actually see the selection being chosen. So if I press enter on this one, then we have the app validator user. Let's do that again. And instead of pressing up and down on the keyboard, we're actually going to select one of these. So for example, we can just press 1 and then press enter, and we have selected that option. Now this is wonderful, especially when you're looking through a whole list of services. At the moment we've only got 3, but just imagine if we scrolled up a little bit here, we can see all of the stuff for perhaps, let's go up a little bit further. Let's get the doctrine stuff. Like this. Now notice the doctrine actually has a service ID of doctrine, so we don't have doctrine dot here, it's just doctrine. So if I was to copy that, I'll show you what selection we get from that. Scroll down here again and then remove app, paste in doctrine. Now this is actually going to pull out that doctrine service, but we know full well that there is other services that start with the service ID of doctrine. So to get around that, what you do, press up again, and this time put in a dot, so it's doctrine dot. Therefore, we're now going to get all of the services that have the service ID of doctrine dot. But notice on number 12 here, we actually have the Sensio framework extra converter dot doctrine dot ORM. So what we're doing is we're not actually searching for service IDs that start with doctrine dot. We're searching for service IDs that contain doctrine dot. So it doesn't matter in the service ID where doctrine dot actually is, because this is right at the end. So that was a quick way of debugging the services and listing out the services that are available to you. Now, if you found this video helpful, then do give it a thumbs up. Do share it around, and also if you've got any comments, questions, or queries, do put them down in the comments section below. If you haven't done so already, please do join me and others on the Discord server. You're also going to be supporting the channel. I'll put a link in the description below. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll see you again next time. Cheers. Bye. In the previous parts of this Symfony service course, we've been looking at how we can
inject our dependencies into services, how we can change the scope of our services as well. And we've been playing a little bit around user validation. Now, in the future parts of this course, I want to be extending those a little bit further. I want to be looking at other parts of Symfony services as well. One thing I would like to do is validate other things, other entities, not just users, but perhaps products as well. And what we're going to do in today's lesson is we're going to refactor what we've currently got. We're going to allow other entities to be validated. So we're going to be changing parts of the code. So let's jump straight into the code and start refactoring our stuff. So in the code here, we are in the default controller. And what we're doing, let's just drag that out a little bit so you can see a little bit more. We are creating a standard class, and that standard class is just got these magic properties: first name, last name, and password. We're then passing that into the user validation service, the validation underscore user, calling the isValid method here, passing in that standard class. Now this is working fine, but it's not really extendable because we are using standard classes here. Standard class doesn't really mean much. What we want to do is actually have different entities that represent different objects that we can validate. At the moment, we're passing the standard class into the isValid of the user validation service. If I was to just drag this out a little bit so you can see, the user validation, has this isValid passing in the user. That implements the validation interface, which is here, and that is the isValid. Now it's just passing in a variable. The variable doesn't have any kind of type around it, so it could be whatever it could be. So it could be an array for all we care about. What we want to do is tie that down a little bit more, enforce the fact that this must be a user, which means that when we have another entity, perhaps it could be a product entity, for instance, we can have its own sort of designated validator interface for that specific product, perhaps. So what we need to do is change a couple of these things. Also, we need to change the validator interface itself, because again, that is just simply just a variable without any kind of definition to that. So the first thing I'm going to do in here is create a new folder, and that entity, we're just going to create a new file. We're going to call this user. Fantastic. So we have our user file here. I'm just going to copy the namespace so I can adjust it up into here. The namespace is going to be app bundle and then entity, like so. And it's just going to have a class. It's just a very simple class, and that class is going to be called user. And if I went into the default controller and just copied these parts into the entity here, let's just bring it down here for reference. What we need is a private first name. That's the first thing. First name, private last name, private password, like so. And let's just get rid of that because I was just using that as reference. Make that a little tidier. Now, in PHP Storm, that's the ID that I'm using. What you can do here is create some comments, define the type, the data type of each one of these, which is just going to be string, and then you can do a clever little thing in a minute that I'll just show you that will build or generate the getters and setters instantly based off of your parameters here, off of your properties. And on a Mac, what you do is you press Command and then N. It brings up a little dialog, and you can choose getters and setters. Select the properties that you want, so we're going to select all of them. Also click on Fluent Setters and then press OK. That's automatically generated you all of the getters and setters you need to set and get each of these properties. Obviously, you could use a constructor and then do all that in the constructor as well, but I prefer it like this. Let's press save here, and then what I'm going to do in the default controller, we're going to, instead of instantiating a new standard class, we're going to instantiate a new user. and that is going to automatically put the use case up here, which is fine. And then instead of doing this kind of stuff, we can do a set of first name, we can do a set of last name, and of course we can do a set of password. Passing in each of these and remove all of that stuff, that's fine, like so. Now, because we've defined the setters as fluent, we don't have to call this anymore. We can just simply do that and remove the end tags here. Bring that out a little bit. So basically we're chaining all of this together, which is pretty handy. We can save that. Now that's going to obviously instantiate the new user, set all the bits and pieces. So you can imagine this is coming from, I don't know, perhaps a form or something. And we're then passing that in to the isValid. Now the problem with isValid is that is defined here. Like I've mentioned, that is just a variable. We want to enforce that this should be a user. So in the validation interface here, we can just do user, press enter. That's going to add the use case like so. Now obviously that's going to break all of this. So if we go to user validation, that needs to be a user now. Save that. That's now going to call the user validator, and it's going to call validate, passing in the user, which means that user validation needs to be a user. Again, that is defined by the validator interface, so let's do that one first. That needs to be a user. Then, of course, that's broken this stuff, so we need to adjust those. And this is the place where the actual validation happens. So instead of calling these magic properties here, we can now do get, and that was first name, get last name, like so. This is just making things a little bit more encapsulated because these are stored as private properties, the first name and last name and so forth. Also, we need to handle the admin too, so we can do a user into that, and that's going to call the parent validate. And this here, we can do get password, like so. Okay, so that's now sorted. We can now pass in an instance of the user. So in the default controller again, we're instantiating a new user, and then we're calling isValid, passing in the user. That is then going to go off to call the validator, the user validator. And also, if it was an admin, we can call the admin validator. This is all handled in the services.yaml. I'll just quickly show you that. What we have here is the user and the admin. This is the thing that's doing all the legwork, and we're injecting a dependency, which is user validator. I could change that to be admin, and it will treat this user validation as an admin. I've shown you that in the previous tutorial, so do check that out if you want to take a look at what this all does. Let's scroll down now. Let's go down into the default controller again. We still have a problem here because with this, we've now coupled the whole interface to be specific to a user. But what happens if we have another entity? What happens if we, say, have a product that we want to validate? Now, if we scroll down here, we have a validation interface that has to have a user. Well, if we had another way of validating something else, like say a product, or if we wanted to validate a book or something, that will probably have the a function called isValid. But what we've said is that isValid can only take a user. So how are we going to handle this? Well, first of all, what I'm going to do is just create ourselves an entity first. So let's just create another file here. We're just going to call this product. Just going to copy that from product here. That's fine. And then just close that off. Call that product. Product is going to have a product title. So we do private title. We're going to have a private description as well. And perhaps we're going to have a private price, maybe, I don't know, something like that. Just keeping it nice and simple. Again, what we're going to do is do a string. This is a string, and price should really be a float, I guess. because it could be £1.99, $1.99 or whatever. Let's now generate those getters and setters. Make sure we have fluent setters on, and that is fine. So let's save that. Okay, in the default controller, we can now instantiate a new product. So let's do product is equal to, new product. And we're going to do product set title, and we're just going to call this foo, and we're going to do set description, and we're just going to call that bar, and we're going to do a price, so set price, and we're going to set that to $1.99, and that's good. Now, how do we go and validate this? Because we've gone and created a new entity here, but how do we validate it like we've done with the user? Well, here what we've done is we've gone to user validation, and we've called is valid, like so. Let's just bring that back. So what I need to do is create myself another validation routine specifically for products. So in here, in the validator, I'm going to create a new, let's just copy that. So copy and then paste that into here. We're just going to call this product validation rather than user validation. So product validation, like so. And that is going to be product validation. It's going to implement the validation interface, but the isValid isn't going to be a product, isn't going to be a user, sorry. It is going to be a product. Now this is going to fail because it's not following the validation interface. That must be a user. We'll get onto this in just a second. Let's continue down the road of creating ourselves a product validation routine. So this needs to be set to product validator. That is going to be a product validator now. Let's remove that. And then that's also going to be a product validator. This is going to be a validator interface. That's fine, but it needs to change to be a product, like so. And what we also need to do is create ourselves some validators. So let's just copy that one here, and we're going to call this product. So this is the actual thing that is going to do the validation. It is going to be product validator. Remove all that. It's going to implement the validator interface, but instead of having a user here, have I gone and yeah, that needs to be a space. Instead of being a user, it needs to be a product. That is the thing that we're validating. So we have a product. This needs to be, there we go, a product, and we're doing errors. We're going to have product get title. We're going to check the title. Please add product title, like so. And here we're also going to have a product. We're going to check the get description. Please add a product description, like so. And let's just ensure that this is all wired up correctly. So we have product validation. It uses that needs to be product rather than user. Product, like so. That's fine. We also need to set the validation interface, just double check that. Yeah, so that's still user. That is a problem. That is also still a user. That is also a problem. What we need to do is we need to change the default controller, call the service to validate the product. Obviously, we need to create our services first in terms of config. So scroll right up to the top. It's in config. It's in services. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to copy this, and we're just going to put that down here. This is going to be validator product. If I could spell it, that would be fantastic. That's going to be a product. validator. And again, we have that, which is going to be a validation of a product. And that is going to be a product validation. Now, later on in this course, I'm going to show you how to make this a little bit more sensible, because at the moment it's not very dry. Dry meaning don't repeat yourself. There's a lot of things that we're repeating here that in the future parts of this course I'll be showing you how to tidy up. So this takes a product validation and it requires the validator of product. So product, which is fine. The problem is, though, with the validator user and validator product, they all implement a similar service. So we have a service called validator interface, and we have a validation interface. This validation interface has a user is required. The validator interface also has a user that is required. Now, how do you get around this when you're trying to use two types of entities when you're trying to validate? Well, that's something that we're going to be focusing on in just a second. What I'm going to do first, though, is just set this all up in the controller. So we have the user validation. That's fine. We're going to do is user valid. We're going to copy that. Let's just drag this out so you can see it a little bit better. We're going to copy this because that's the user validation. We're also going to do product validation now. So product validation. This is going to be validation of a product. And that is going to be product validation here. And we're passing in the product like so. And this obviously needs to change to be product. Okay, so we've got the controller set up. We've got the user, we've got the product. We're validating each one in turn, but like I said, we've broken it because of these interfaces. We've coupled these interfaces to be those specific things. So how do we go about doing this? How do we go and inject those interfaces into the relevant validation or validator service? This is something that we're going to be focusing on now. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is tackle the user validation. Now, the thing is, when you've got two entities that need to be validated and your validation classes are coupled to what it is that you are validating, what you need to do is sort of think about it from another sort of abstract level. So yes, you're validating a product, yes, you're validating a user, but actually those things require common bits and pieces, so the is valid, but they also require their own ways of validating themselves. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to let's just close that. We're going to create a new file, and we're just going to call this user validation interface. Okay, so this is going to be the interface specifically for the user. We're also going to create a new file, and we're going to call this a product validation interface, like so. Let's just copy the validation interface over to these things. Okay, so obviously I need to change that interface name to be a product validation interface, but here we can have a product, like so, and change that to be product. Remove that use case because we're not using users anymore. And again, with the user validation interface, we can call that user validation interface, passing in a user. That is fine. Okay, so we now have basically duplicated ourselves. We have a product validation interface. We have a user validation interface. They might have other bits and pieces as well to validate their stuff. So, for example, a product validation interface may have other properties specifically for a product that perhaps the user validation interface won't have. But what we've done here is we've basically duplicated ourselves across the two, meaning that we can get rid of this interface if we wanted to. The thing is, though, like I said, there's common things about a validation routine that we might want to use. So for example, regardless of what it is that we're validating, we might want to have a log of all the errors that were thrown. So instead of having is valid, perhaps we need to have get errors, like so. And get errors is just going to return an array. So we don't actually need to couple this to any particular validation routine. Let's press save on that. So now we have three different validation interfaces. The first one, this one here, validation interface, just has a function that gets the errors. The user validation interface is valid, but it has to be a user. The product validation interface here also is valid, but it has to be a product, which means now we can change these and tailor these concrete classes to specifically be what it is that we're after. So instead of validation interface, we're going to implement the product validation interface, and let's save that. So that tidies that class up, and again in the user validation we're going to implement the user validation interface. Now what are we going to do with the actual normal validation interface? This is the generic common interface. We have get errors. In the validators themselves, what we're doing when we're validating these things, we're just supplying these as errors and so forth. The validate is just returning these errors. But what I would like to do is have a way of logging these, recording these in some sort of private routine that all validator interfaces, all entities that are validated can access. So what we're going to do in the user validator here is we're also going to, let's just drag this out so you can see a little bit better. We're also going to do a comma, and we're going to implement the usual validator interface. That will also require the use of a public function, which is get errors, like so. And that is going to return this user validator get errors. I know I haven't done this yet. I haven't actually put this in yet, but I will do so. Let's save that. That is going to, let's put in some comments here. That is going to return an array of errors, which means that the user validator needs to have the get errors routine. Let's just copy that. Save that, bring that out a little bit so you can access the other files. So let's focus on the user validator for now. That needs to have, bring that out a little bit, that needs to have get errors. So public function get errors, like so. And that is just going to return the errors, so this errors, which means that we need to have a private errors array, and for every time this we have an error here, we can do this errors and then add that up to that, like so, and that's just going to return this errors. So we don't need that anymore. So we're going to do a similar thing for the product validation as well. So we're just going to copy that into product validator. That is going to implement the another interface for specifically for products, which I'll handle in just a second. And this here is going to do this errors, like so. We don't need that, that's fine. Okay, so we don't need that either. Okay, so that that requires a product which is broken because of the validator interface here. I'm just going to I'll deal with that in just a second. We also need admin. Admin, I think, yeah, extends that, so we can now do this because it extends it, what we need to do is set that to be protected, so we can have access to that in the scope. So as admin validator, we can now do this. This errors is equal to that, as well as this errors, we add that on. In fact, we don't need to do that anymore. We just need to validate the routine because we're storing the errors. And then again, we just return that. That's fine. So let's fix the product validator. This is broken because we're passing in a product and not a user in the validator interface. The validator interface has a user here. Let's just walk our way back, though, and see what we've done with the validation routine. We're going to do a similar thing here, but for the validators. The validation routines, they are user and they are product, and we've split them up by having different types of interfaces. So the user has a user validation interface. It also has a validation interface. There is something wrong here. Must be declared abstract or implement validate. Oh, I've gone and muddled that up, haven't I? So that needs to be, sorry, that needs to be a validation interface, I believe. There we go. Yeah, so that's fixed. So let's just drag that out. So we now have the user validation interface and the validation interface. User validation is more geared towards users. Validation interface is just the generic interface that all validation classes should adopt, which is a similar pattern to what we're going to do with this up here, the validators. So we're going to create a new file, and we're just going to have user validator. Interface is going to be very similar to this. However, it is just going to have, so that's, we'll call that user interface, but that's going to supply the user. We're also going to have a product interface. I'm just going to copy that into here. So let's just paste that in. We call this product validator interface. Change this obviously because this is now a product thing, and that takes a product instead of a user, so we can remove that. So it's again, it's very similar to this pattern in the sense that we have another two interfaces, and those two interfaces are geared specifically towards what it is that they're actually validating. Now, the actual validator interface itself needs to have get errors, because this is the thing that is going to return the errors, so we don't need that up here, of all of the other concrete classes. So here we've got user validator has get errors, which is this errors up here, which is fine, and user validator also implements the user validator interface, like so, and also the product validator also implements the product validator interface. And one of the points that I want to make in this tutorial is that when you start finding yourself being too tightly coupled to certain things, what you should be doing is creating yourself other classes that allow for places to store perhaps generic abstract kind of methods. For example, the get errors method belongs to both the user and the product validators and validations and so forth. But the way in which we validate needs to be specific to what it is that we're validating. That's why we have the product validator interface that has the validate function, which requires a product. I better put that in as product, sorry. And we have the user validator interface that also has a validate, and that requires a user. Let me just double check that is, yeah, that validate product, that's fine. So going back to our controller now, what we've done as a recap, we've created two entities. One is a user, one is a product, and these are in the entity folders here. They're simply just collections of bits and pieces. So we have title, description, and price for product. We have first name, last name, password for the user. Okay, back into the controller. What we've done is we've called the user validation service to check whether the user is valid. And very similar to that, we've also called the product validation service to check whether the product is valid. But the problem we had was the interfaces were very coupled to those kind of entities, right? So it was very tightly coupled to the user entity, which meant that we couldn't validate the product entity very well. So what I ended up doing was creating 2 extra interfaces for the validation and 2 extra interfaces for the validators. And then what you can do is change what implements what. So, for example, with the product validation, we implement the product validation interface. For the user validation, we implement the user validation interface. And I've just realized, of course, that the product validation also needs to implement the validation interface. That also needs to return get errors like so. And that is going to do this product validator and its get errors like so. And we can access get errors here because it is a validator interface. Okay, so this could be a user, this could be whatever, but as long as it adheres to the validator interface, we have get errors, because get errors is defined in here, which also means that in the default controller, I can do if one of these was invalid. So for example, if I was to remove this, for instance, so if that was just an empty string, and also remove the first name here, we can do save, because if we went to the browser, refresh the page, we can now see that they're both invalid. So is user valid is false, is product valid is false. But we don't actually know what is wrong here, but we can access those because we now have those the get errors. So if I went back into the tutorial, we can now do user validation is valid, and let's just set that to be false. So if is valid is false, then what we can do is a for each of user validation get errors as error, and then we can print that out. So we can do HTML like so, and concat that to be the error. And because it's HTML, we can do a BR. Obviously I need to pass in the user as well, like so. So let's refresh the page, see what happens. And as we can see, we now have the output, please add first name. Now the reason why this is coming out twice is because we're validating it twice. Is if I went back into the tutorial, we're calling is valid, passing in the user here, that does the validation, but also we're doing it here, so is valid like so. What we could do is tidy this up a little bit more. So instead of just saying user valid and so forth, doing a JSON encoding of that, we can do is valid or is user valid, passing in that like so, and then we can do a JSON encode of that variable, which is fine. And then we don't need to validate that again, that's fine. We then just run through this. So if I was to save that, refresh the page, it should now only validate it once, hopefully. Let's go back to the browser here, refresh the page. Yeah, okay, so we've got this problem here. Please add the first name, which is fine, because if I went back into PHP Storm again, into the tutorial, let's change that to my name again, and remove the last name, press save, go back into the browser and refresh the page. We can see that it's now changed to please add the last name. Let's now just make sure that this is still running for the product. So go back into the tutorial. Let's do a similar thing here. So where we've got the is valid of the product, let's just bring that out so make a little bit more room. Let's copy that, put that in as is product valid. Like so, and then that is going to be the JSON encoding of that. So that's going to get the string representation of the Boolean, which is fine. And let's just copy that as well. It's not very dry, I know, but just for this purpose, it's going to be fine. Let's put that in, and then that is obviously the product validation of get errors. So let's save that, scroll up to the top here. Let's put that back in to be my surname, and then on the set title, we've already removed that. That's fine. So let's save that. So now we should have an error with the product rather than an error with the user. So let's go back into the browser, refresh the page, and now we can see that the user in this case is valid, but the product is invalid. So we've got the please add product title written here. So that's great. We've got different types of ways that we can validate things because we've got different entities that we're validating, both the product and the user, and we're using very similar ways of retrieving these things from the controller. So is valid and get errors. We're bubbling up the errors from the validators. So the validators will be saving the errors or logging the errors into their own little arrays of errors, and then that bubbles up through to here. So we have a get errors thing here, and then that will use the validator get errors and return that, and that's how we access that from the controller. Now, something I want to point out here is if we scroll up to the top to the services, there is an awful lot of services that we're starting to add. We've got 24 lines of services, or 7 to 24 here. There are ways that we can change this and make this a little bit more dry, make it a little bit more user-friendly. Perhaps there is going to be another entity that we want to supply. A point that I want to make here is that by decoupling our classes, we're also increasing the amount of configuration that we are supplying, because there's all of this stuff. And we might want to be implementing logging routines into these sort of validation bits and pieces as well. So you might want to log whenever someone creates an invalid request. That's something that we're going to be looking at later on. But that would mean that we would have to inject a logging service into both of these validation routines. And you're going to end up duplicating yourself. This is something that we're going to be focusing on in future tutorials, how we can change the configuration to be a little bit more extendable and flow a little bit better, read a little bit better, because you put in another 5 services and it's going to get quite beefy, quite weighty. So that is what we're going to be focusing on in future tutorials. Now, I appreciate this has been a bit of a long tutorial, but I've covered a lot of ground, and I've sort of laid the foundations for future tutorials as well. If you found this tutorial helpful, then do give it a thumbs up, show your appreciation. If you've got any comments or queries about today's tutorial or any tutorials within this series, do let me know, put them in the comments section below. Do subscribe to pick up the future Symfony services tutorials, as well as all the web chats and discussions that I do throughout the week. Thanks ever so much. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll see you again next time. Cheers. Bye. Not only can we inject different classes into our services, but we can also inject different configuration, properties and parameters and so forth into our services, which means that they are highly configurable, because these parameters can be set in our parameters.yaml file, they can be set in our configuration, they can be set in other places as well. And what we do is we use the constructor, or we use some setter methods to set those parameters within our class. That is what we're going to be focusing on in today's tutorial. So let's dive straight into the PHP Storm IDE here, and we're going to be focusing on the admin validator. So this is tutorial 5 in the GitHub repository, and here we can see that this property, or this value of 5, is hard-coded into this class. this will check the get password value, and it'll check it against the length of 5. If it is less than 5, it will throw an error. It will set that to this errors. This is something that we did in the previous tutorial, and it will check for the value. If it is less than 5, we have this error. Now, this value of 5 is hard-coded inside this class here. So in today's tutorial, what I'm going to do is inject that value of 5 into this class. So let's go ahead and set this up. We need a public function, which is the constructor. The constructor is going to take a single argument. We're going to call this min password length, like so, and we're just going to set a private property called min password length again. Let's just copy that over to here, like so. I'm just going to give it a comment with the data type of int, and we're then here just going to do this min password is equal to min password, or password length. Let's save that. And then here we can grab that from this. So let's do this min password length. So let's just drag this out a little bit so you can see it more. So what this is doing is we have a constructor. We're passing in the argument min password length, setting that in the constructor like so. And then when we validate the admin user, it's checking that value against the length of the password. If it is less than the length that we supply, then an error is thrown, which means that we can now tailor this within our services.yaml file. Let's just save that, and let's open up the services.yaml file. That is in app config in services.yaml. What we're doing here, this is basically how it was left in tutorial 4. We're supplying the user validator. We want to be supplying this time the admin validator, switching it from this validator or this service to this service. And now we want to supply an argument to this service here. We supply the argument just like we would supply this class. So let's just copy that and put that in here like so. But because this is a parameter that we are injecting into this service, we need to handle it slightly differently. Now up here, can you see parameters? And we have this key value pair here, which is commented out. We have parameter underscore name, and then colon, and then the value. This is the parameter name, this is the parameter value. Again, this could be from, say, the parameters file. Oops, just move that back. This could be from the parameters.yaml file as well. It doesn't have to be set at this in this file. So what we're going to do is uncomment that out, and we're going to create our own parameter. Let's call this admin dot and then min underscore password underscore length. And the value, sorry, just change that. The value we're going to supply as, let's just say 3 for now. So if it is less than 3, then it will throw an error. Now what we do is we can supply this parameter into here, but notice that this argument has an @ symbol. An @ symbol means that it is another service that has been defined already. But what we need is a parameter, and parameters are defined using the percentage signs on either side, so percentage symbols. So like so, and we save that. Now what we're doing is we're injecting the value 3 as the first argument into the constructor of admin validator. And I've mentioned before that it's not just the constructor that we can actually use to set things. I'll be demonstrating that in a future tutorial. I want to keep this tutorial nice and small and simple and quick for this one. But right now what we're doing here is we're just simply injecting the value of 3 based on this parameter, like so, as this argument. So let's save that. Let's go straight back into the validator. So validation in admin validator, just to recap what we've done, we're calling the constructor and passing in 3 into here and then setting that like so. In our default controller, what we're doing is we're supplying a password which is 3. So let's say that is 1, for instance, and save. This should now throw us an error. Let's save that. Go back into the browser and refresh the page. So if I refresh the page here, that should now be false, and we have please have a better password. Okay, let's play with this a little bit. So let's go back into the tutorial. Let's go up to the services.yaml file, change that to be 10, and then hit save. And let's go back to the browser and refresh the page. This should also fail. But if we go back into the tutorial and have a password which is greater than 10, so let's go back into the default controller here. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Let's save that. That should pass. So let's go back into the browser, refresh the page. That should be true, because that is not less than 10. Now, like I've mentioned, we can set these parameters in various places. We don't have to use the services.yaml file. The advantage of using parameters like this means that you can use those parameters in different places as well. So if we needed to use the value of 3 as a definition of the minimum admin password, then we can use that in other places too. Now, if you found this video helpful, then do give it a thumbs up. Let me know if you've got any comments, questions, or queries. Put them down in the comments section below. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone, and I will see you again in the next tutorial. Cheers. Bye. In the previous tutorial, I mentioned that we can use different ways of injecting our dependencies into services. We don't have to go through the service constructor. We can also call upon a set method to actually set our dependencies as the service is being instantiated. This is what we're going to be focusing on in today's tutorial. So let's go into PHP Storm and take a look at our admin validator. Now, in the previous tutorial, we injected this minimum password length into the constructor, which is an integer, and we were using that here. But what happens if we want to inject something else, but perhaps we can't inject it through the constructor? Maybe we're using some sort of factory design pattern and we're calling upon a setter method. Factory design patterns are something we're going to be focusing on later on in this course as well. Let's just go straight into the services.yaml. We were passing that in as an argument. That is the parameter that we supplied, the admin.min_password length, setting that value to 10. That is how we were supplying that into our service constructor. But like I said, what we need to do in this case is we need to go back into the admin validator and create ourselves a setting method. So let's say, for example, we want to set a logging interface so we can actually log when a user supplies a wrong invalid password. So here we've got please have a better password. That's just going into the errors array, but we may wish to log that somewhere. We may wish to record when a user supplies an invalid password. So let's create our property. Let's go private and call that logger. This is going to be an instance of the monologue logger, like that, like this. And instead of putting it through the constructor that we would normally do, we're actually going to create a setting method. So public function and then set logger, like so. We're going to supply an instance of logger and the value of logger, like so. This is just going to set this logger to be the variable of logger, and then let's just return the current instance. So let's save that.
Let's now just put in some comments to make it a little bit more tidier. So that is what we're supplying. We need to have the logger. Now, the beauty of using the setting methods means that you don't have to set them if you don't need to set them. So be very cautious when you're using the class. Make sure that we actually have an instance of logger before we attempt to use it. So anyway, let's go now into the services.yaml and see how we can inject that dependency into this service. Beforehand, we were using the arguments here, and that was passing that into the constructor. But of course, what we need to do is call that set logger method. And what we use is the section called calls, and that is an array of methods that we are calling. Now we need to supply the methods that we are calling. We do this within another array where the index is the name of the method that we wish to call. So in this case, it is just set logger, like so. And of course, your method may have multiple arguments that are required. So for instance, not only are we setting the logger here, but we might also be supplying the level in which we wish to log things at, or so forth. But let's just keep it nice and simple. Let's just set the logger. So we're going to put in a comma and then another array, and this array is going to be the arguments that we wish to supply. So in this case, we need to supply the service of the logger. So let's put in some quotes like so, and inside those quotes we need to have an @ symbol, because @ symbols means that we are calling upon another service, and this service is just going to be logger, like so. I haven't mentioned anything about the Symfony monolog logger before in these tutorials, so I'm going to keep it nice and light for this one. This is how we call a setter method to inject another dependency. Let's hit save now, go straight back into the admin validator, and now we can start to use this logger. So where we're saying this errors and we're setting another part of the array to this value, what we can do, let's just copy that value like so, that string, create another message array. I'm just going to drag this out so you can see it a little bit better. And we're going to just set that to this value like so. Just remove those for now. We don't need those. And then put in a colon at the end. And then we can supply message to the errors array. We can also now do this logger and supply what it is that we wish to log. Now, the logger does have multiple ways or multiple levels that you can log things at. I'm going to be focusing on this later on in another course perhaps. Right now I'm just going to use info and we're going to supply the message, which is like so. Now, of course, the logger also has different ways that we can supply the context of the logging information, but that's optional. We're just going to keep it like this for now. Let's hit save. Let's go back into the services.yaml just to make sure. We need to supply a minimum length of 10. Otherwise, we have an error. So let's go straight back into the default controller where we are calling set password. Let's remove that. So we're only setting 3. This should cause an error, therefore that should log that error to the log file. Let's hit save. So let's refresh the page, and as you can see, we have please have a better password. That is the message that we have just caused. So in theory, we should have this in the log file. So let's go into the terminal this time. We've got, this is the server running on this tab, and in this terminal tab, what we do is just do tail. We're going to do a -f because we want to follow the log as well. The log file is an app and it's in logs, and I think the log file is dev.log. So let's press enter here. Now, this is a whole lot of gobbledygook, but you can see, please have a better password, please have a better password. That has been added to the log file. I'm just going to press a couple of spaces just to make some room, and then I'm going to go back to the browser and refresh the page again, and we should have some more output. So let's go back to the terminal, and you can see that we have a bunch of spaces here that I've just added, but now we have the please have a better password. So that is a very basic usage of the logging service in Symfony. Now, the advantages of using the setter method like this is that we don't have to use the setter method if we don't need to. So this dependency isn't necessarily required. Also, we can call the setter method in multiple times. So for example, if you're adding something to a collection of objects or collection of dependencies, that is very useful too. The disadvantage, of course, when injecting things through setter methods is that you cannot be sure that the setter method has been called. So if the setter method wasn't called and we ran that, we would have an error because the logger hasn't been injected into our service. Now, there is another way that we can inject our things into services, such as using public methods. This is what I'm going to be focusing on in the next tutorial. But if you found this tutorial helpful, do give it a thumbs up, do share it around to anyone else who may find it useful, and let me know if you've got any comments. Put your comments down in the comments section below. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye.
Welcome to the 7th tutorial in the Symfony Services course. Now, we've injected our dependencies via a constructor. We've also used setter methods to inject our dependencies as well. In the previous tutorial, what we did is we injected the logger service into our admin validator class using the setter method of setLogger. We can actually use property injection as well. We can actually inject properties into our classes. This is what we're going to be focusing on in today's tutorial. So let's go into PHP Storm here. And what we're going to do is we're going to inject this message, please have a better password, into the admin validator class. This is tutorial 7. This is in the GitHub repository. The link to that is in the description below, and it will be in the descriptions of all of the tutorials in this series as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to inject this message into this class. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a property. Now this property needs to have the visibility scope of public. So let's do a public property. We're going to call this property min password length message. Not a very good property name, I know, but just for this example, it will do. We're going to equal that to a default property, and we're going to scroll down here. We're going to just pass that in to the value. So that's what we're going to use. So instead of, if we scroll here, instead of using the message, we can now do this min password length message, and we're going to use that as well for the message here. Let's save that. We can remove the message for now, this message variable, because we don't need to use that. After we've saved that, we can now go up into the services.yaml file, and we can look at how we can inject that in. So here we have the app validator underscore admin. This is the service that we're configuring. We have the class here, the admin validator. We're passing in the argument of the min password length. That is what's going into the constructor. We're also setting the logger using the setLogger method. That's called when this service is instantiated. We're also going to now supply a public property, the property that we created in our class. So we can do properties. We can have another section here called properties, like so, and we're going to supply the property that we wish to use. So I'm just going to save this for now. We're just going to go straight back into admin validator, because what I'm going to do is just copy that property, because that is what we want to inject. Then go into the services.yaml, put that in as the property, and that is the key, and we're going to supply the value of injected message, like so. Okay, so we are now injecting the min password length message as a public property into the class. Now it has to be a public property because it needs to be accessed from outside of the class. This happens when the class is instantiated, and then once it's instantiated, we then set the public property. Let's save that, go back into the browser, refresh the page, and we can see that we have this message here, which is injected message. So if I went back into the PHP Storm here, change that to, say, A, B, and C, save that, go back into the browser, refresh the page again, we should see that that's changed to ABC. So we are injecting that message into our service. Now, the reason why I added a default to that property value, if we go back in to the IDE here, PHP Storm, scroll down to go into the admin validator, we have this default, which is please have a better password. The reason why I did that, of course, is because we cannot guarantee that these public properties are being accessed, being set. So, for example, if I removed the configuration in the services.yaml, so if I just removed that, for instance, save this, then go back into the browser, refresh the page, we should have the default message that we have supplied in the class. One of the disadvantages of using public properties to inject things into our services is that we can't be sure if it has been injected. Also, you can't define the data type of the property that you are injecting. So you cannot ensure that this is a string, or this is an integer, or this is a class. But of course, you can do that. You can define the data type that you are injecting if you're using a constructor, if you are using a setter method as well. Because in those function signatures, you can define a data type. You can define whether it is a string, whether it is an integer, whether it is a class. You cannot do that from a public property. Let me just give you an example here. Let's go back into the tutorial. So what I'm going to do is alter how the logger gets injected into this admin validator class. Now we know that it is an instance of the monolog logger. It is the service because it has an @ symbol here. I'm going to inject this as the first argument into the constructor. So we're just going to add another argument here. We're going to call this logger like so. And of course, what we're going to do is remove this for now. I'm just going to remove that like so. Let's save that, go back straight into the admin validator. We're no longer calling the set logger, but that's not necessarily required. We've changed the first argument of the constructor here. It must be a logger. It must be an instance of logger, and therefore we need to have the logger variable like so. Let's now put that in to here. So let's do this. Logger is equal to logger like so. And I guess what we could do is just comment that out for now because we're not actually calling that. That is fine. So let's go back into the browser and refresh the page. As we can see, we haven't broken anything, so that is fine. So let's go back into PHP Storm in the IDE and change how the logger is injected into this admin validator class. Let's change that to be public because what we want to do is inject this as a public property into this class. Remove logger from here like so, removing that up there. Save that, go back into the services.yaml. Instead of injecting it into here, what we need to do is inject it in the property. So I'm just going to press Ctrl Z all the way into properties here. This is a logger like so, and that needs to be at logger. Let's remove this because that doesn't exist. Let's hit save, and what we're doing is we're injecting the logger now as a public property. Now this should work like normal. So let's go back into the browser, refresh the page, and yes, it does work. However, because in the services file here, because we're injecting it as a public property and we're not going through any kind of function signature that checks the data type, we cannot ensure that this logger is correct. So, for example, let's say logger property, let's change that to be just foo and then bar. This is going to break, and there is no enforcing that the logger property, the public property, must be the logger service. So let's just refresh the page. This is just going to blow up. So let's go back into the browser, and as you can see, it is completely failed because info, that is the logger method that we're calling, is now being called on a string, so it's just completely broken. But there was no way to ensure that that public property was a logger instance. So let's go back into the tutorial. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to put that back to the call of setLogger. So let's just remove that for now. Let's hit save, go back into the admin validator. Let's just uncomment this like so, set that back to private. Now what I'm going to do is just save this, go straight back into the services.yaml, and this time, instead of passing the logger service to setLogger, let's now set that to foo bar again and see the difference in error message. So let's save that, go back to the browser, refresh the page, and we should have a completely different error message where we're saying the type error, argument 1, passed to @bundle validation validator, admin validator, setLogger must be an instance of monologue logger, and the string was given. So we now have better error messages because we need to conform to the data type that method signature has. So let's go back to the IDE and tidy this all up. And this is the same, of course, if we're supplying this to the constructor, because of course with the constructor it is a method. That method can have a signature to that, including the data types that we are supplying. So let's just remove that and put that back to setLogger. Go back to the browser and refresh the page. This should now work as it did before. So that was injecting properties into our services. I must say it has more disadvantages than advantages. However, you may have to use this, especially if you're relying on third-party pieces of software or packages that rely on public properties being set. If you've got any comments, questions, or queries on this tutorial or any other tutorials that I've done, please put them down in the comment section below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If this tutorial has helped at all, then do show it some love, give it a thumbs up. Do subscribe as well, because I've got more Symfony services tutorials coming up as well, plus other tutorials regarding web development and programming. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll see you again in the next tutorial. Cheers, bye. In today's Symfony Services tutorial, we're going to be looking at how we can deprecate our services. Now, this is very useful when you're upgrading your systems and you want to make it aware that you are going to deprecate certain services in future versions of your application. So, for example, you could have an open source project, and that project is being used by lots of other developers and other projects, and you want to have a roadmap where you are upgrading or changing your classes in the future versions. And so what you would do is you would put a deprecated warning on your service, which means that the other developers have enough time in order to change and upgrade their systems to allow them to be compatible with your new releases when your new services have been built. Symfony uses this as well whenever they are upgrading their components and their services. They will deprecate the services that will no longer be used in future versions of Symfony. Okay, let's go straight into the tutorial now and let's start deprecating our services. So we have the app validator admin service here, and what we're going to do is just deprecate that. This is going to put a info message in our log file whenever that service is being used. In order to deprecate our services, we need to add another section to our service configuration, and that is called deprecated. And by default, we can just add a tilde. Now that is just going to add the default message in the log file. Let's save that. Let's go back into the browser, refresh the page. Notice nothing has actually changed. We haven't prevented this class from being used. However, there will be a message in the log saying that this service is now deprecated. So let's go into the terminal. If we go into this tab of the terminal, if we did a tail, and we're going to follow that, so -F, and then app log and then devlog. In this log file, we should be able to scroll up and see an app.info log message saying that the app validator _admin service is deprecated. You should stop using it as it will be removed soon. This is the automatic message that has been supplied, but what we can do is change that message as well. So let's just Control C to come out of this and go straight back into PHP Storm. Where we have the tilde here, we can actually put in a message. So it's a string, and you must ensure that you have the service ID within percentage symbols, like so. Service _ID. If you don't, then it's going to throw you an error. So service ID is deprecated and will be removed in version, I don't know, 1.2, and then please use app.foobar or something like that. Whatever. Let's just hit save. Go back into the browser and refresh the page again. Let's go back into the terminal window. Let's scroll up here. We should see that the message has been changed. So here we go. PHP info app validator admin is deprecated and will be removed in version 1.2. Please use app.foobar. So that is how you deprecate your services. It's a very powerful thing to do because you're notifying the developers that are using your project that that service that they're using will no longer exist or be replaced by something else. Yes, you could inject the logger service into your service and then use that as a means of deprecating your services. However, that means you're depending on the logger service, and deprecating services should only be a temporary thing. You shouldn't have to rely on the logger service in order to do that. And therefore, this is a great mechanism to use when you are notifying other developers that are using your project that your service will be replaced or be no longer used in future versions. If you found this tutorial helpful, do give it a thumbs up, do share it around, and if you've got any questions, comments, or queries, put them down in the comments section below. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll see you again next time. Cheers. Bye. Hello and welcome to the 9th part of the Symfony Services course. Today we're going to be focusing on private and public services. So let's dive straight into the tutorial. This is the 9th tutorial in this course, and this will be added to the GitHub repository. I'll provide a link in the description below. So we're in the default controller here, and as you can see, we are pulling out two services, the app.validation user and app.validation product. So we are publicly accessing two services from the dependency container in Symfony using this get and this get down here. But if we look in app and config and we go into the services.yaml, we can see that we actually have lots of services that have been defined. In fact, we have 5 services: the app validator user, the validator admin, the validator product, and the validation user and the validation product. So we actually have 5 services here, but we're only publicly accessing 2 of them. Now, this means that we can set the other services as private. And in doing so, we actually gain a little bit of performance. So the ones that we can set as private are the ones that are being injected into these services. So, for example, the validator admin and the validator product. These can be set to private. And we do this by adding another definition to our services config. So if we add in here public and we set this to be false, like so, we're now saying that the validator admin service cannot be accessed publicly from the container. However, it can still be treated like a dependency to another service. So let's add public false to the validator user, like so, and let's add false to this one too. So they are all set to false apart from these two. If we save the file and refresh the browser here, we should see that nothing has actually changed. Now, if you do have a lot of the services that aren't actually being accessed publicly, if you set them to private, then you do gain a small bit of performance, because there is a performance overhead when pulling out a service publicly. But what happens if you set a service as private and try and pull that publicly from the service container? Let's go back to the tutorial and grab public false, set that as the service definition for the validation user. Let's save that. We cannot pull that publicly from the container. So in order to fix this, we need to go back into the tutorial here and set that to be true. Refresh the page and we should see that that has now fixed, which it has. So when defining your services, ensure that you're setting them to either public or private. If, for instance, your services are going to be accessible publicly from the container, as in getting them out of the container in a controller, then yes, they should be set to public. However, if your services are merely just dependencies that are injected into other services, then you may as well set them to be false. And in doing so, you do gain a small performance overhead. If you found this tutorial helpful, then do give it a thumbs up. Do share it around to others that might find it useful as well. If you've got any comments, questions, or queries on this tutorial or any other tutorial in this series, then leave them in the comment section below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you want any code reviewed, then do check out the Discord server as well. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye.